Yes. Good afternoon. It's a great honor to again welcome Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer back from last year, both from last year and also from last night and this morning. Ambassador Kurtzer holds the S. Daniel Abraham Chair in Middle East Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. This is following a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, where he held many distinguished positions, among which were the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt from 1997 to 2001, as the Ambassador to Israel from 2001 to 2005, and particularly important for today, as the Red Sox play at Fenway, as the first commissioner of the Professional Israel Baseball League. Ambassador Kurtzer, Professor, has written and published widely, and as we heard last night, is being read by Secretary of State Kerry as we speak to deal with the situation moment to moment. The movement from the complex and harsh realities of security and politics that we heard so clearly defined for us last night to the eloquent and erudite discussion of Kedusha, holiness, of the land and also of our behavior that we discussed this morning at Torah study has personal resonance for me as I contemplate the possibility of this very special trip to Israel that we have the opportunity to take in early April with Rabbi Morrison and other congregants. To take what we're learning here from Ambassador Kurtzer as our distinguished scholar into the land itself, to study there, seems an opportunity not to be missed. That is a plug from the Shameless Commerce Division of Temple Israel. But without further ado, please welcome Ambassador Kurtzer.
Shabbat Shalom. This is the how-to section of the Scholar-in-Residence. I'm going to tell you how to be an ambassador. Now, for those of you who don't want to join the Foreign Service, give about $500,000 to the next president. For those of you who do want to join the Foreign Service, you have to work very hard. I'm just kidding. Not a good way to introduce this subject, because it's actually a serious subject. In 1997, President Bill Clinton invited me to become the ambassador of the United States to the Arab Republic of Egypt. And then in 2001, President George W. Bush invited me to become the United States ambassador to the State of Israel. This had been the culmination of, at that time, a 20-year career. It ultimately became 29 years of diplomacy and of service to our country. And I have to start out by telling you that there could have been no greater privilege to which we would have been subject to than being asked to do this. Having said that, Sheila and I flew into Cairo in January of 1998 to take up our posting. About an hour outside of Cairo, we looked at each other and said, now what do we do? Because even though, having been in the Foreign Service, I had participated in presidential visits and in a range of diplomatic activities associated with ambassadors, the position is actually quite daunting. The reason is that you have, maybe I'll do testing 1, 2, 3. How are we doing? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Sort of like diplomacy.
Yeah. Exactly. The reason it's daunting is that there's no single description of the roles that an ambassador must play at a post, particularly a post the size of Cairo, which in 1998 was the largest U.S. embassy in the world. I had 2,200 employees, and about 900 of them Americans with family members. And so you are the leader and manager of a large bureaucratic organization. We had 19 agencies of the American government represented at post. The State Department component of the embassy was actually one of the smallest components. In other words, the core diplomatic section of the embassy was not the largest by far. By far the largest was the Agency for International Development, which also meant that I had fiduciary responsibility for something like $5 billion of American assistance in the pipeline over the years to Egypt. Second largest component was the United States military, our Office of Military Cooperation, in which we were delivering American equipment and American military training and hopefully indoctrinating the Egyptian army into the American way of warfare so that they would be interoperable with us, as they proved to be capable of in 1990 when they fought alongside of us in the Gulf War. And that was an additional several $billion of military assistance in the pipeline. You're also the mayor of a small American community, because the American community in Egypt, not just that associated with the embassy, but also the larger community of business people and others, looks to the American ambassador to solve problems. And one of the first issues I faced in Cairo, for example, was a drug problem at the American school. The school administrators could not figure out how to deal with a problem on their campus. This was a large American school. And it was a problem exacerbated by the fact that the security provided to the school by Egyptian police was in large part responsible for the drug problem. They were selling the drugs to the kids on the campus. So it was not just a problem inside the American school, it became a diplomatic problem of how you deal with the Egyptian authorities. And then, of course, you have the role of chief diplomat, and you have the role of acting as, in a way, plenipotentiary for the President of the United States. Every ambassador who goes out to post receives a letter from the President that says, "You are my personal representative in the country to which you have been assigned." And what that means in protocolary terms is that you are the highest ranking American whenever anybody visits that country except for the President of the United States. Now, when the Vice President, in this case Al Gore, visited, of course, I gave him protocol precedence. But it tells you how significant this position can be and what can be made of it by the incumbent. So when I've talked to our future diplomats in the State Department, or have had occasion to talk to ambassadors going out to post for the first time, the only advice that I've given them is, you can make of this position whatever it is you want to make of it. If you want to see this position as a few years of parties and protocol activities and entertainment, you can do that. And you can become quite popular among the population of the country where you're at. If you want to really work hard and do as many things as you possibly can do in the course of 24 hours, you can also do that. Sheila and I chose the latter method. And we chose it for a variety of reasons. Number one, who knows if one would ever get another opportunity to fulfill this multiplicity of roles. Number two, we happen to have been assigned to two of the most important embassies that the United States maintains around the world. And number three, there was a lot to do, and there were a lot of people to motivate. When I got to Cairo, one of the first things I did with my secretary was to say, I want to schedule time with every section in the embassy, not during the first week, but over the course of the first few weeks, because I wanted not only to hear what they were doing, but I wanted to give them a sense that I believed that what they were doing was important. And both of us have mentioned often we recall having gone through the cultural section of the American embassy. There are ambassadors who care about culture, and there are those who don't. My predecessor didn't. And so the cultural affairs section, when we visited on that first period, was quite depressed because they felt underutilized, and I guess in today's terminology of a government shutdown, they felt like they were non-essential personnel in the embassy. So I said to them, look, I want you to be as busy and as active as you can be. I will support you, but I want to see a program that brings out the best of American culture that we can share with the Egyptian people. Because we're not just doing this for entertainment purposes. We want to challenge Egyptians to understand who we are and what we are, why we are, and why we do the things that we do. 3 years later, when I did my walkthroughs upon leaving Cairo and visited our cultural section, they were exhausted, but happy, because we had kept them very, very busy. When we ran out of funds available to us from Washington, I raised funds from the American business community. So, for example, my predecessor had canceled our July 4th party for lack of funds. It costs a lot of money, and we don't have a lot of money. I brought the American business community together and said, if you want a July 4th party, I need you to support it. And there are rules and regulations on how to do that. But it's not just going to be a lifting a cup and toasting the United States. I want to do something different. So what we did was bring over an American conductor, an American soloist, and we put on a program of American music at the Cairo Opera House. In fact, we had 2 programs that night so that people could come through. They could have their oneg and then walk into the cultural activity. And it was entirely different. It had never been done before. I think anywhere in the world, certainly not in Cairo. So it got people's attention. We brought over a performance of Porgy and Bess, to which we invited Mrs. Mubarak, and she was bored out of her mind. But we were happy because it was an example of American culture that no one in Egypt had any understanding of. We brought over speakers and scholars. Charles Hamilton, who had marched with Martin Luther King and gone on to become a professor of American history at Columbia University, had retired. And I brought him over to give a series of lectures on the civil rights movement. Now, some people ask me, well, why are you doing this in a country where they don't have a similar kind of issue? What I really wanted was, and what he did, is for Professor Hamilton to explain what was the strategy of change that the civil rights movement had adopted. Many of us think, and he in fact said this, that the civil rights movement was designed to change attitudes, what was in people's hearts. And he started out the first lecture by saying it was exactly what we were not doing. We were changing laws. And we were hoping that by changing laws, you then changed behaviors, and over time, perhaps in a generation or 2 or 3, you would change what people believe in their hearts. So who knows how this impacted on Egyptians who just 11 years later were to start their own revolutionary period, which is now continuing and which I'll talk about tomorrow. That's my advertisement for the next session of this Scholar-in-Residence weekend. So the role of ambassador that I played and that Sheila and I played together in both Egypt and Israel truly was of our own making. And we tried to utilize as much of the day both on substantive matters, I conducting business with the Egyptian government, Egyptian business community, non-governmental organizations, Sheila reaching out not just to the American community, but also to the diplomatic community and to the community of Egyptian senior officials whose spouses very often were not part of the diplomatic process. One of the culminating events in Sheila's experience was inviting Mrs. Mubarak to lunch and Mrs. Mubarak accepting lunch, something she had done only once before in the very long tenure of Hosni Mubarak as president of Egypt. And I think there was no question in my mind that it was a recognition of Sheila's outreach to the Egyptian community that convinced the president's wife that this was worth her time. Did we accomplish anything during our years in Egypt and years in Israel? That's for others to measure. But I think we did. And to give you one example, right after we arrived, I got notice from the State Department that Vice President Al Gore was visiting the Middle East and planning to go to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, but not to Egypt. Now, I argued with the State Department desk officer and said this makes no sense, not just because of Egypt's size and importance, but also because the vice president in that administration had undertaken a relationship with 3 countries in order to promote certain kinds of change, with Russia, South Africa, and Egypt. It was called in Egypt the Gore-Mubarak Partnership, which was designed to stimulate economic reform in Egypt and to build the idea that a more private sector-focused economy, together with public-private partnerships, would be a better way of moving forward than state-led economic growth. So I said to the State Department officer who told me about the Vice President's trip that this made no sense. If there's a Gore-Mubarak partnership in Egypt, why isn't the Vice President coming to Egypt? And the State Department officer said to me, we tried and they're too busy and we can't get them to pay attention. And one thing you can do as an ambassador is communicate with the President and the Vice President. You don't do it very often. But I figured I had little to lose. The worst they could do was fire me, so I shot off a message to the Vice President, respectful, saying to him, if you are coming to this region, and if you have the Gore-Mubarak partnership as one of your 3 signature activities internationally, it would not only make great sense for you to come, but we could use it to good effect, because we had been talking to the Egyptians about what's called a Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which is a prelude to a free trade agreement. And we had not gotten much traction in moving forward in this direction. And so I said in my note to the Vice President that we will not only be able to get traction, but that we were going to try our best to actually conclude that agreement in time for him to have a signing ceremony, a so-called deliverable. You hear that word a lot when principals travel. They want to actually accomplish something, even though those of us who work on these issues know that the trip itself becomes important, but the principles like a photo op and a ceremony. Well, the Vice President decided to come over the objections of his staff. We did get the attention of the Egyptians, and late the afternoon of the one-day visit of the Vice President of the United States, we signed a Trade and Investment Framework Agreement. Not without challenges. It almost failed an hour before it was supposed to be signed. These are serious agreements. They involve obligations and commitments on the part of 2 governments. But we were able to put it together using the Vice President's visit as a kind of having a galvanizing effect on people's thinking. In Israel, we had similar experiences. I arrived in Israel about 7 months after the second Intifada had started. In fact, just a month after the first suicide bombing at the Dolphinarium in Tel Aviv. In fact, on the day we arrived, my last instruction from Secretary of State Colin Powell and from President Bush, whom I saw before we left, was to see whether or not there was an opening for the United States to help bring about an end of the Intifada. Well, that was when I left Washington. By the time we arrived in Israel, 12 hours later, there was a suicide bombing in Binyamina train station in northern Israel, and my instructions had changed. We were then in a mode of basically supporting Israel as it dealt with this, what was to become very challenging problem of suicide bombing. Well, when the Intifada started, Israel decided to stop paying the Palestinians the tax revenues that they were owed under the Oslo Agreement. Just to fill in the backfill, under Oslo, the Israelis and Palestinians agreed that all of the imports coming through Ashdod port to Gaza and the West Bank would be handled by Israel. Israel would keep an accounting of the customs and duties that were owed on those imports. And at the end of every month, there would be a reconciliation of the books, and Israel would hand over a check to the Palestinian Authority. You're talking about a lot of money. It was almost $100 million or more every month. So by the time we arrived in Israel, there was almost $1 billion in arrears that Israel had basically put into an escrow account in a bank. And the Palestinian Authority was hurting, just not being able to pay salaries and to pay its ongoing costs. Israel was not to be budged on this question, and they had a good argument. Why would we pay over this money? They weren't taking the money, they were holding the money aside. But why, they said, should we pay over this money when the people to whom we're paying are killing us? So when they stop killing us, we'll resume a relationship. And here you can see the bank account, but we're not going to pay the money while this is happening. Well, shortly after we arrived, about 6 months later, under tremendous pressure from the international community, Yasser Arafat appointed a new finance minister named Salam Fayyad, ultimately became prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. And people paid attention to this because Fayyad had not only been educated in the United States. He used to greet visitors this way. You know what this is? University of Texas, the Longhorns. And he was a college football fan from his days of getting his PhD in Texas. He had worked for the International Monetary Fund, had a sterling reputation, had run a bank in Jordan with great integrity. And all of a sudden, Palestinian finances, which had been subject to tremendous concern because of the degree to which Arafat was known to be diverting money that was coming in to the Palestinian economy for his own purposes, paying off, obviously, for terrorism. All of a sudden, you had a Palestinian finance minister who, on the first day in office, put the Palestinian budget online and basically said, judge me by what you see. Here it is. You're going to see what comes in and what goes out, and if anything's missing, you can ask me about it. Well, about a week later, I never had met him, but a week later, I called up our consul general in Jerusalem, and I said, I want to invite Fayyad to lunch with a senior Israeli official, and I want to have them talk about whether or not there's a way to unlock these funds that had been held aside. I have to tell you at this point, I had not consulted Washington. Because had I consulted Washington, it would have taken 2 weeks for them to come back with a non-answer. They would have been beset by difficulties. Should we do it? Should we not do it? What if we give him authority and it backfires and we get into trouble? So we just did it. It's one of those things you call unless otherwise instructed. So the Consul General and I invited Fayyad and a senior Israeli official to lunch. The four of us had lunch in our residence, and from that, 2 months later, the two of them reached an agreement which persuaded Israel that the money that would be handed over to Fayyad could be watched over closely enough that it would not be diverted for other purposes. Now, the Israelis knew as well as we knew that money is fungible, so if that money was not going to terrorism, Arafat would find other money to go to terrorism. But the Israelis did not want to starve the Palestinian Authority either. And so if they felt comfortable that the money they were handing over for tax purposes was being safeguarded, and they did feel comfortable with Fayyad, they were ready to launch this agreement. So much so that one of the sticking points in the agreement was whether or not the United States would pay for one of the big 8 accounting firms to basically have a permanent presence in Ramallah to oversee the financial operations of the Palestinian Authority. It was a very hard issue to deal with because, number one, it costs a lot of money, and we do operate with limited budgets. And secondly, the Palestinians said, we may not have a great track record, but we also don't want somebody kind of sitting on our shoulders, watching us every single day on how every single penny is being spent. And we negotiated, and we finally reached an agreement by which the United States undertook to do this. And then as soon as the agreement went into effect, the Israelis said, we don't need it. We trust him. So in fact, they had the capability or the agreement of the Palestinians to institute this process, but they didn't actually actualize it in practice. So in both countries, these are examples of things that one could do either under instructions from Washington or through the initiative of our embassies. And as I mentioned, my job was to motivate our embassies to be thinking creatively about ways that we could advance American interests in the peace process, of course, but also in our bilateral relations with both countries. In so doing, there's also a whole range of just day-to-day operational things that an embassy has to do. We run very large consular operations. The only legislated function of an American embassy is the protection of the safety and welfare of Americans overseas. And so there are large parts of the embassy whose job it is to keep in touch with the American community. We ask Americans, even today, to register with our embassies when they travel so that the embassies will know where they are in case there's some kind of a problem and they have to be in touch with you. And then, if there is such a problem, the embassies have to be organized well enough to do something about it, to have a so-called warden system so that you can get in touch with people. This became real for us in Israel on 9/11, when immediately upon watching the news of what was happening in the United States, the embassy ordered a lockdown of all American institutions and installations in Israel until we could determine whether or not this was a threat that was going to spread globally. Now, the reality was, of course, in Israel, the Israelis take care of their own security, which becomes a way of taking care of our security. But it was my responsibility for example, the American school, that we immediately shut it down and set up a task force within the embassy to monitor not only the information we were getting from a very beleaguered Washington, but also to monitor information relevant to us on the ground, and to make sure that we knew where all Americans were, even those who didn't want to deal with us, settlers living in the West Bank who had more animosity towards the American government than, in some cases, our enemies. But it was our responsibility to make sure that they were okay and they were healthy. And it's one of those functions that you don't hear about a lot, but that motivates embassies really quite significantly. There's another aspect of the work that we did, which in some ways, I guess in many ways, was unique. And I need to just fill in a little bit of personal background so you understand context. Sheila and I were both educated in Jewish day schools, and we are basically observant in our religious practice. Maintain a kosher home. We won't eat meat and things like that outside the house. And so when you're in Washington and you're trying to conduct your life as an American diplomat, their challenges are there. I told the State Department over the years that I would never miss a critical activity on a Saturday, but that I would not show up simply to catch up on my work on a Saturday. I could do that on a Sunday, or I could do it the rest of the week. In fact, there was an interesting story. In 1985, we were at that point also stationed in Israel in our first overseas assignments, and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State came to visit, and we sat down for lunch one day during his visit, and he said, "What do you want to do when you come back to Washington?" So I said, "Well, I'd like to actually work in the Near East Bureau. It's my field, it's my area." And he said, "Well, it's probably not going to be possible, because we're so busy Monday through Friday that we put aside a lot of our work for Saturday, and we come in and we're wearing jeans and we kind of think and so forth, and that we do that on Saturday." So I said to him, "Bill, I said, I can think the rest of the week as well, and when I need to be there on Saturday, I will be, but I think I can do this." 2 years later, I replaced him in his position, which was kind of satisfying, and it worked out. It worked out pretty well in terms of what we were able to do. Were compromises required on my part? Sure. Did every occasion that presented itself for my going in on a Saturday warrant it being an emergency? Of course not. When I traveled with the Secretary of State, were all of those trips of a nature that required my being on his plane on Saturday? Of course not. But this was the measurement that I made with regard to personal observance and professional obligation. So, by way of background, when we approached our life in Cairo and Tel Aviv as representing the United States, there's now an additional layer of responsibility, because we're not the Jewish American ambassadors, we are the American ambassador. And how we would be accepted and whether we would be respected for what we do in either country was going to be quite important. And I have to tell you that this challenge stayed with us not just during our tenure in Egypt, but for the entire 8 years that we served our country in both Egypt and Israel. It started out in Egypt, of course, with the functional necessity of making the kitchen of the American residence in Cairo, Egypt, kosher. Not so simple. First of all, if one takes this seriously, it means getting 2 new sets of dishes and pots and pans, and either 2 new sets of utensils or finding a way to make kosher existing silverware. So I approached the Undersecretary of Management in the State Department, a man I knew well, and I said, Patrick, I need place settings for 100, but I need 2 of them. I need one for dairy and I need one for meat. Now, Patrick Kennedy, obviously not of the tribe, but a very wise and very kind man, said, I can probably give you 36 of one, but I can't give you 100 of both. Up stepped an American donor, and the dishes and the utensils and the pots and pans were donated to the American government for use by ambassadors. We would be the first who wanted to keep their residence kosher. We then needed to figure out, how do you make the kitchen kosher in a place like Cairo? So we found a fellow in Silver Spring, Maryland, who had had experience working before Passovers in hotels, changing their kitchen over. And he also happened to know a little Arabic, which was a great advantage. And we brought him over on our own nickel. And he helped both kosher the kitchen and train the staff. Now, what became interesting was that once the staff in Cairo was trained, they became ultra-Orthodox with respect to kashrut observance. I'll give you an example. Sheila had instituted a practice in our kitchen that to distinguish between our use of dairy and the use of meat, when we were using meat, they were asked to put a lucite cover over the counters. Now, you don't need to do that, but Sheila wanted them to know that something was different when they moved from dairy to meat. So one day, or maybe it was the opposite, I can't remember, but one day Sheila goes down to the kitchen in the afternoon, wants to make herself a cup of coffee, takes out the milk to put in the coffee, and Jaban, the sous chef, comes running over and says, Madame, you cannot do that. We haven't put the lucite down. And so they reminded us that we were not observing our own kashrut observances. Our Shabbats in Cairo were unique and wonderful. Very often we would be alone, but quite often we'd have visitors who were passing through. We kind of got to be known as the only place to have a kosher meal between Eilat and Nairobi. So anybody passing through that region, including some congressional delegations where people wanted kosher food, would take advantage of it. One of the first weekends that we were alone, we were having our Shabbat meal, and we were singing one of the Shabbat songs, and we heard stirring on the stairway. Our residence, the official representational floor was downstairs, the main floor, and then our residence was the next 2 floors. And so we heard some stirring on the stairs, but nobody came in. So Sheila went over to the doorway, and our cook, a gentleman named Hamid, was standing by the door. And she said, Hamid, what are you doing there? And he says, I like to hear the singing. And he loved to come up on Shabbat. He would walk in every Shabbat that we were home, and he would go, Shabbat Shalom. This is an Egyptian Muslim, quite religious. But he liked the idea that he was not required to serve pork products. He didn't have to handle things that were, to him, also not acceptable. There are lots of stories. I'll just share one more in this vein. We arrived in January, the first Sukkot holiday. We call Hamid in and say, Hamid, we have a requirement on this holiday which is going to be a little hard to explain. You have to build this kind of temporary booth, and it has to sit there for 8 days. He says, Madame, Ambassador, I know what you need. You need a chus. I said, what's a chus? He said, come with me. So we got into the car. We go out to the Egyptian countryside. And all over the Egyptian countryside are Sukkot. Because what are Sukkot? It's an agricultural hut that's used during various seasons to allow people, farmers, to stay in the fields and not have to go home. And he said, that's what you want. We said, yeah, that's exactly what we want. He built us, I have to tell you, the most magnificent sukkah that we have ever seen. It was made entirely of palm fronds, entirely. And it was just beautiful. We have pictures of it that are really quite extraordinary. So what we thought were going to be the challenges of practice turned out not to be challenges of practice. And it was not easy. You had to think through all aspects of what we take for granted in the United States. You run out of chicken in the United States, you go to the butcher. In Egypt, you had to think about that 4 months in advance because Sheila had arranged with the United States military to put our chicken order through their commissary system, but you had to order 3 or 4 months in advance. So all of the things that we take for granted as just being available had to be planned. The receptivity on the part of Egyptians was also quite an adventure. Even though we had served in Egypt and I had kept in touch with many Egyptians over the years. In fact, many Egyptians whom I had known as relatively junior officials in 1979 to 82 had grown up in the meantime. And some of my contacts were now ministers. Amr Musa, for example, whom I knew as an office director in 1980, was the foreign minister when I arrived back in Egypt in 1998. So we were not unknown to the Egyptian officialdom, but we were unknown to the rest of Egyptians. And we were greeted with a 3-month campaign of malicious anti-Semitism, venomous anti-Semitism, that went far beyond, they say that an anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary. Well, this was real anti-Semitism. They really took off after us in a way that was really quite challenging, to a point where about 3 months into our tenure, the main article in one of the Egyptian weeklies suggested that what we were really doing in the kitchen of the residence was akin to the blood libel. We were doing nefarious things with blood and things like that, really awful stuff. So awful, in fact, that that very night, Egyptians came up to us at one of the receptions we attended and started apologizing, saying, "This is not us. This is the press. Don't pay attention." And it kind of broke the back of the issue. It got so bad that it ended up getting fine. Now, I can't tell you that people became philo-Semitic as a result of this, but what I had asked for when I arrived in Egypt was to be judged as the American ambassador. And if I did my job well, I wanted people to judge me on that basis. And if I did my job poorly, I wanted people to judge me on that basis. I did not want to be judged on the basis of my religion. And so the day after, for example, this episode with the blood libel, I wrote a letter to 8 Egyptian newspapers and magazines and basically said, "Judge me on what I do, not who I am, and judge me on the basis of being a person who's trying to observe his religion with the same dignity and respect that you observe your religions, whether it be Islam and Christianity." And I think that also had an impact in calming the waters. The stories in Egypt go on and on. The last one I would tell before switching to Israel had to do with President Mubarak himself. I have to tell you, now that he's out of office and he has been demonized in the American press, that he was not a demon. And I had a tremendous amount of respect for him. Yes, he was an authoritarian dictator, but he was not Saddam Hussein. He didn't bring people into his office and shoot them as Saddam Hussein did. There were significant human rights abuses over the years. We talked about them. We tried to apply as much pressure as we could to change things in Egypt. But he was not an evil person. And I ended up, during my tenure, with a great amount of respect for him. When we arrived, ambassadors are supposed to, what's called, present their credentials to the head of state. And what those credentials are a letter from the president that I referred to earlier that says, "This is the person I've designated to stand in for me when I'm not there. And I ask you, the head of state, to accept this person." You also present what are called letters of recall. In a sense, it's a letter of resignation. Should the country to which you've been assigned lose confidence in you, they basically don't have to kick you out. All they have to do is activate this letter. It's a very interesting system. So you immediately have it's a fail-safe for problems that you have. So it's a ceremony, normally not very substantive, but it's one that every ambassador experiences. I arrived during Ramadan in January of '98, and the Egyptian authorities said to me, look, you can do business until the end of Ramadan, but we're not going to schedule your credential ceremony until after the holidays, which was fine. Come after the holidays, I was out at meetings, and my secretary calls me and says, I have good news and not so good news. The good news is your credential ceremony has been scheduled. The bad news is it's on Saturday. So I said, well, that's okay. I know where the president holds the ceremony, and there's a hotel nearby. I said, I'll stay at a hotel, and I'll walk over to the ceremony. And she calls back. She says, you can't do that, because there's a protocol to this ceremony that requires you to ride in the limousine, the president's own limousine, that he sends for you. So I said, okay, not a problem. Let him send the limousine. I'll walk alongside, and we'll enter at the same time. And she called back and said, they will not allow you to do that. So I'm still out on the road. I said to her, I'll figure this out when I get back to the embassy. I get back to the embassy, and she says to me, I don't know what happened, but they decided to move the ceremony to Tuesday. So we held the ceremony on Tuesday, and it was fine. It took a few minutes. About a week later, I get a call that the president wants to see me on certain issues. So I went to his office, and we met on a number of issues, at the end of which he started a practice that he was to follow over the next 3 years, which was he liked to chat. And especially he liked to chat as we got to know each other, and he would tell me the good stuff after we had our formal meeting. The gossip about other Arab leaders or about the inner workings of the Egyptian system. At this time, though, he says to me, he says, I have some of my aides are really quite stupid. So I said, well, why are you saying that, Mr. President? He says, well, they come to me one day and they say, American ambassador won't come to a credential ceremony. So I said to my aides, why won't he come to a credential ceremony? He said, because he won't ride on Saturday. So the president says, well, I told them do it on Tuesday. This was Mubarak, the common sense response, which was, okay, don't make a big deal about it, just change the date. But it also suggests that very often, without a common sense outcome, these are little things that could end up having very large impacts. So, since I have a limited amount of time and Shabbat at some point will end, I'm going to move to Israel at this point, but only to suggest to you that the experience that we had in Egypt, as unique as it was, could really fill a volume of anecdotes and stories, all of which had great meaning for us. The happy events that we were able to participate in, the funny events in which we sometimes were the focus of the event, the time we were invited to a memorial service for President Sadat. We were on our way to taking a day off in the countryside, and Sheila, dressed quite nicely in a white outfit with a purple scarf, and walked into the women's section, a sea of black. And so you knew exactly who the wife of the American ambassador was at that point. But in a sense, it didn't matter, because by that time we were known, and there was a kind of acceptance of the fact that we were both visitors in this country, but also friendly to our Egyptian counterparts. The challenges in Israel, both professionally and personally to us, were no less daunting than they were in Egypt. The kashrut business, of course, was a little easier. We didn't have to order our kosher food through the United States military. You can get kosher food in Israel, for those of you who are interested to know that. Our chef, an Israeli immigrant from South Africa, had trained even though he himself was not kosher, had trained in preparation of kosher food. But what we found in inviting Israelis from all the various political parties is that the divide between religious and secular in Israel is such that many of the secular Jews in Israel don't have experiences in situations in which there are any religious components whatsoever. For example, when I was serving as ambassador, the Shinui party was part of the coalition. Shinui was You recall the party of Tommy Lapid, the father of the current minister, Yair Lapid. Tommy Lapid, a Holocaust survivor, was vehemently anti-religious and affirmatively secular. So we would invite a lot of these people for Shabbat dinners. It was the time when you could actually sit and relax. And we would invite people from both Lapid and from his party. And time and again, Israelis would tell us it's the first time they had heard Kiddush in 30 years or 25 years. So it was a way of understanding that there's not just an ideological divide in Israel, but people live entirely separate lives. And so don't understand each other because they don't talk to each other. They don't have occasions in which they mix. And it was one of our great pleasures that our table was able to be used as an occasion to bring people from religious parties and people from secular parties, and we had Israeli Arab Knesset members all together, and they were able to converse freely. You learn a lot about even people who are wearing kippot, who are religious. We invited a Knesset member from one of the religious parties, and in the course of the stand-up cocktail hour before dinner, he came up to me and said, you know, it's not that I don't trust your kashrut here, but, I would prefer if I had either vegetarian or fruit as a main dish. I said, sure, no problem. And I went into the kitchen and told our chef. About 15 minutes later, we're not yet sitting down. He comes over and he says, maybe if you have fish, I'll have fish. I said, okay, well, let's see what we got. By the time he sat down, he was eating the meat and the chicken, not just because he was hungry, but because the ambiance of the occasion had convinced him that this was something different. He didn't have to put on the air of an ultra-Orthodox person. There was a kind of atmosphere created in which I don't know what his own personal beliefs or practices were. Maybe he, in fact, didn't normally eat in other people's homes, but this was an occasion when he did. So there was a lot of there were a lot of interesting experiences like this, even in Israel, where one would not have expected it. But the Israeli experience was in large part not only defined by those examples, but by the fact that for 3.5 of our 4 years, we were living with the Palestinian Intifada. American ambassadors, as I mentioned, are responsible for the American community, but no American ambassador is expected to attend the funerals or shiva of 42 American citizens who, in the case of the Intifada, were killed during the Intifada. Happened to be in the wrong place. Students at the Hebrew University, riding on buses, in cafes. And you feel not only the pain of the society in which you're living, but you see it in real terms because you're interacting with people who have sustained loss. We sustained our own family loss. My cousin was killed in a terrorist attack on a bus in Jerusalem in 2003. So everything gets driven home in a much more intense way during what is clearly a very intense period. But even in that period, there's scope for actions, not just the Salam Fayyad story, but also the ability that we had as American representatives to reinforce the idea that the United States stood side by side with Israel, both in good times and in challenging times. And it was a result of that standing side by side with Israel that we were also able to talk honestly and in a straightforward manner with Israel. I was able, during the course of the 4.5 years that we served in Israel, to establish a very strong relationship with Ariel Sharon. He was the prime minister during the entire period that I served as ambassador, which I have told my colleagues in the State Department makes me a hero for having to deal with Ariel Sharon for 4.5 years. But we found out that he is a far more complex character than one would understand from his press. Yes, he is the bulldozer, as he's called by many people. And he tried to bulldoze me many times, in person and on the phone, When that didn't work, he is also a charmer. We compared him to a 19th century European gentleman at times. He is a very canny political figure, not just the brilliant general who served in the Israeli army for 28 years and innovated a number of military tactics that continue to be taught at Israeli military schools, but one of the most interesting political operatives anywhere in the world. I remember one day watching him at work in the Knesset, but watching him at work in the Knesset was watching a man sit at the prime minister's seat and not moving for 3 hours, but the world swirling around him, periodically people interacting with him, and he's directing things, but not in a frenetic manner. And at the end of the day, he had gotten what he wanted on that day. He got the vote that he needed. He was a man who understood when others were doing their job. I said to Sharon on the first meeting that we had that there were 2 things that I would promise him, and he could hold me to during the course of my tenure. Number 1 is that I would never operate behind his back through the Israeli media, which in Israel is just part of the national pastime. Everybody works with the media, but as the American ambassador, I felt it was not my job to communicate with Sharon through the press. If I wanted to talk to him, not only could I reach him at any time, but very often he would call me and say, "Why haven't I heard from you for the last 4 or 5 days?" We talked all the time. And second, I said to him, "I'm not going to play politics." Well, when I said that, Sharon said, "Look, I'm not going to hold you to that promise, because if you don't play politics, you're not going to do your job." So we both laughed. A couple of years later, I understood how wise he was. You remember in December of 2003, he announced for the first time the idea of disengagement from Gaza, ultimately to carry it out in the summer of 2005. Well, in that period of 2003 to 2005, there was a tremendous ferment in Israel about whether or not this was a good idea. And you recall that Sharon lost the support of his own party. Likud abandoned him. He called a referendum within Likud, and he lost the referendum. But he went ahead anyway and carried out the disengagement, and then created this new party of Kadima. During this period, I think it was November of 2004, he called me up on a Thursday afternoon and said, "I need to see you immediately." So I went up to Jerusalem that evening, and we sat in his office, and he said, we have a big vote coming up on Sunday on some aspect of disengagement. He says, "I'm going to lose it." He said, I don't have the votes to win, and I need something from the United States. Now, the backdrop to this was, those of you may recall, in April of 2004, Sharon had visited Washington, and President Bush had given Sharon a letter that had 2 important components in it that Sharon was able to use in his political system. Number 1, the United States said that we would support an outcome in the peace process if there was an agreement in which Palestinian refugees would find their homes in the new state of Palestine, not in the state of Israel. Now, it was worded very carefully. We didn't prescribe that outcome, but we said we would support it, which is quite important for Israel. And we also said that we would support an agreement in which Israel would retain certain settlement blocks, certain areas that had been populated in the interim period by Israeli settlers, also important for Sharon. So we had delivered political cookies that Sharon was able to serve up to his cabinet to keep them in line. 6 months later, he now tells me that he's running into a crisis. He needs something more from the United States. So he finished his presentation, and I said to him, "Mr. Prime Minister, I will report this faithfully, and I'll see what Washington responds, but I also want to tell you that you're not going to lose the vote on Sunday." So he kind of sat back in his chair. He said, "What are you saying?" I said, "Well, during the last 10 days, I've met with all of your ministers and talked about these issues. And you have the support of," and I listed off the ministers who I believed would support him. And he laughed and reminded me of our conversation 2 years previously. He said, "Well, I see you not only have played politics, but you've done your homework." So the reality was that we didn't have to deliver anything. I did report the conversation faithfully to Washington. I also reported my own activities. In other words, my assessment that Sharon was not going to lose the vote. He, in fact, won the vote that Sunday. But it suggests to you that the wisdom of Sharon in understanding that an American ambassador who is doing his or her job is not immune from playing in the Israeli political system. We were able to enjoy his company often at the residence. He came for Sukkot in our Sukkah. He came for Hanukkah one year. Highlight for members of our family who happened to be visiting to this day. So we had relationships both with Sharon on the Israeli side and with President and Mrs. Mubarak on the Egyptian side that really made the experience quite extraordinary. It's probably wise to stop there, and as you've noticed, I've kind of tried to do two things, bekitsur, in summary. One is to just give you a little bit of a taste of what an American ambassador can do as he or she decides to do it and what might be accomplished, whether it's in Egypt or in Angola or in Luxembourg. There are issues that we face around the world as a global power that gives our ambassadors tremendous reach if they choose to extend that reach. But also to give you a little bit of flavor in our different circumstances of what it was like to represent the United States, consistent with our own religious beliefs, not only in a place like Israel, but also as the first Jewish ambassador of the United States in the Arab world outside Morocco. So I hope either of those two was of interest to you. I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Would you stand?
Yes. I read in the paper today something about Carolyn Kennedy and she's going to Japan. I wondered, is there a training process and orientation? I mean, ambassadors come from so many different...
I'll repeat the question, so it's okay. Yeah, all right. You can do that. Yeah.
Ambassadors come from so many different career routes. So what is the American diplomacy about? Is there a training program? Is it an orientation? I mean, Carolyn Kennedy obviously has had no experience in diplomacy. How does that work?
I'm going to give a response that has nothing to do with Carolyn Kennedy in particular, because she may do a wonderful job, but I do want to use the occasion to suggest that we may not be doing ourselves much of a favor by this predisposition on the part of presidents to use ambassadorships as rewards for political contributions. You know, I tried a bad joke at the beginning of how you can become an ambassador, and the reality is that's how you can become an ambassador. If you either contribute a large amount of money or bundle it and handle yourself well, you can pick and choose where you go. And the question really is, aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot by not taking advantage of an opportunity to put somebody in place who might do all of these things? Now, it doesn't mean that non-career people can't do these things. We have had phenomenal non-career ambassadors. Thomas Watson, who headed IBM, was our ambassador in Moscow. Daniel Patrick Moynihan in India. John Kenneth Galbraith in India. We've had Michael Mansfield in Japan. These are people of great stature. They have tremendous capabilities, and you know they're going to work, and they're going to learn what it takes to run this particular type of enterprise. But can you say the same thing about a real estate magnate who may be very successful in his or her business and then is transposed into an entirely different environment with not necessarily the language or the regional background? And you're really taking a large risk. It might work, but it also might not work. And I think we're doing ourselves a tremendous disservice by continuing this practice, and yet presidents tend to see, and not just this president, this has been going on for years, they tend to see the ambassadorial positions as one of the highlight sinecures that we give to political contributors. The training that career people get is varied. First of all, we have whatever number of years of experience and expertise that we've accumulated. And so I served in Egypt and Israel early in my career As I mentioned, I had established contacts with people who were to become senior officials during my tenure. I had been involved in serious negotiations. I was a member of the American peace team for almost 15 years before becoming ambassador, including during the shuttle diplomacy of James Baker that brought about the Madrid Peace Conference. I was the manager of our peace process activities after Madrid, in which we conducted multilateral negotiations that were taking place all around the world almost every day. A constant activity of diplomacy and political engagement and politics. And so when the president said, I'm ready to appoint you as ambassador, in this case to Egypt, there was a CV, there was a resume. Now, the State Department actually doesn't do very much training in the run-up immediately to an ambassadorship. There's, in fact, only a 2-week what's called ambassadorial seminar, which is a combination of people coming in to share experiences, and they train you a little bit in how to handle public relations, but it's 2 weeks. So Caroline Kennedy probably has gone through that 2-week training and has now been thrust into this diplomatic maelstrom in Tokyo. And I actually feel a little bit sorry for people who are asked to do this. This actually happened. At the time, I was a bit of a wise guy in doing this, but there was a congressional staff investigation of this practice. It probably goes back 25 years. And I was asked to meet with this congressional staff group. And they said to me, do you have any proposals for us? I said, yeah, actually, I have one I think is quite creative. I said, if presidents believe that people who have contributed at that time $200,000, price tag has now gone up, because they've been successful in their business are qualified to be ambassadors, presumably they have the same skill sets as those who have put 20 years in and accumulated the diplomatic experience. So, for every political appointee who comes from the private sector, the person from the State Department who didn't get appointed ought to take over that business for 3 years. And I'll run the real estate business in Florida because I must have the same skill set as that person. Well, it was the end of my appearance before that committee. They didn't take it very seriously. But, the point really is, if there is some professional qualification to being an ambassador, then the presidents are hurting themselves badly by continuing this practice. If there are no professional qualification of being ambassador, then let's just do away with the State Department. You can save a lot of money and conduct diplomacy by phone, by Twitter, and by rewarding 200 people for contributions rather than 50 or 60. I think you see I feel strongly about this issue. Yeah. One second, we got the mic coming over. Technically, you don't have to, but in this case, my Hebrew is relatively fluent and my Arabic is dangerous, meaning nobody quite knows what I know and don't know, and therefore they have to be careful. So it was a help. Sheila actually studied Arabic. It was much more useful because it was colloquial. It was able to get her through a day, whereas I was studying classical Arabic. So I could read Ibn Khaldun, but nobody reads Ibn Khaldun anymore. So, yeah.
It may be more diplomatic not to ask this, but I'm going to ask this because it's an opportunity to. Our president was pretty emphatic that he wanted chemical warfare against Syria stopped, but was going to take it to Congress so that the American people spoke with one voice. Congress has answered back by shutting down the American government. How do you deal with that in the foreign arena to allies, people in the Arab community?
Yeah, the acoustics were not great.
Congress has answered back by not taking that up, but instead by shutting down the American government. I mean, we're in partial shutdown.
Oh. So you're asking about how we're perceived internationally as a result both of Congress's concern about chemical weapons and the shutdown? it looks like amateur hour in Washington. We're perceived very badly. You know, you've all read about the suggestion of the diminishing of American power, and this has become a real problem, not necessarily because it's true, but because the perception of it is growing. And what has happened over the past few weeks, rather than being seen as a triumph, leave out the government closure for a moment, deal with that separately, but rather than the president's recourse to Congress being seen as the triumph of a democratic system in which you have equal power centers that have to be taken into account, it's been defined only as a sign of presidential weakness, rather than being defined as an element of coercive diplomacy which prompted President Putin to step in with a proposal to resolve the issue. It's being taken as a sign of weakness. So without this backdrop perception of American weakness, we would be looking actually quite strong these days, because we have 3 diplomatic processes underway. I mentioned last night Secretary Kerry's very significant work to reactivate the Palestinian-Israeli peace track, the opening that now exists with respect to Iran, an opening that's got to be handled quite carefully, and now the possibility that even if we don't resolve the internal Syrian conflict, the possibility of removing chemical weapons from Syria's arsenal and gaining adherence to the Chemical Weapons Convention is a huge diplomatic success. But it's not being seen that way against the backdrop of this perception of weakness. Now, against that backdrop, you then have the political gridlock in Washington, which, you know, the rest of the world has looked at and, you know, not paid much attention to, and then all of a sudden the place is closed. And it's not only closed, but it's every day more nonsense comes out. The House just voted, maybe today or yesterday, to pay the federal workers who have been furloughed. Now, if you're going to do a shutdown, which I think is horrible, then you got to do a shutdown. But you're shutting the government down so there are no services provided, and then you're going to pay the people? So what's the gain? Nothing. There's no gain. And it just looks, if you pardon my English, stupid. And our government right now looks stupid. John Boehner and the Republicans are acting in a manner that's unimaginable. There's a law on the books, whether or not you like Obamacare or you don't like Obamacare, it is law. And there are ways to challenge that law. Every challenge of that law so far, except one, I think, has failed in the judicial system. Obamacare has passed our constitutional tests, but the Republicans have found a different way to sabotage it. They're holding the entire American government hostage. And the rest of the world watches this. We're now on display. So not only are what should be diplomatic potential successes being undervalued, but now it's being seen against the backdrop of a dysfunctional political system, and we're not looking very good. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about, you know, the Egypt and Iran and Syria issues. You're now an Egyptian, and the Americans come in and start telling you how to formulate democratic processes, and you're saying to yourself, whoa, I'm watching CNN while this ambassador is telling me what to do? Sir.
I'd love to hear your take on what about American policy in the Middle East with regard to, first, in Egypt, America's urging Mubarak to step down and whatever work we did to have that happen, and then looking to see what, and then, you know, seeing what happened after he'd left, the Muslim Brotherhood taking over, and what a debacle that's been, and then where are we going in Syria with the debate on what do we do about Assad, and do we propose or be a proponent of his overthrow, and who's going to take over for him? So,
yeah, but if I answer this question today, then it absolves you of the responsibility to come tomorrow morning.
Don't give him that. Just.
What am I going to say tomorrow morning? So I'm going to only give you a teaser. I'll give you the answer tomorrow morning.
I'm curious. A number of years ago when I was in Israel, we were with a group that was up in Ariel, and the mayor there was so proud that he was raising a lot of money from Christian fundamentalists. And I'm wondering if, as ambassador and in the political situation that you were involved in, did you have any conversations or interactions with this? And how does that work when you have this group that is taking on a political act, even within our own Congress, vis-a-vis the Israelis?
Somebody asked me last night about the power of AIPAC. If you want the real power of the pro-Israel lobby in this country, it's Christian fundamentalists. That's where the real power is. AIPAC has a certain role to play, but there's a tremendous reservoir of support, right-wing support for Israel in the Christian fundamentalist community, the evangelical community. As ambassador, I had very little contact with that community because their focus was on the West Bank, on settlements, and for them, as for many Jews with right-wing political views, the American embassy, American government was part of the problem, not part of the solution. I did have contact with settlers. I had one very curious and amusing contact. About 2 weeks before the disengagement in the summer of 2005, I received a message that the leaders of the Yesha Council, the Settler Council, wanted to meet me urgently. So we set up a meeting time in Jerusalem, and they came in and they asked if I would please appeal to the American government to force Israel not to carry out disengagement because of its undemocratic nature. There had been this referendum vote, and Sharon had lost it, and the settlers were saying, since that's an anti-democratic move, the American government should support us. So I told them I was not sure. I would report their conversation, but not sure I could support the sentiment. So no, we didn't have much. We had contact in terms of keeping up with developments in the settlements community. Didn't have much contact with the evangelical community. The last thing I'd note on this, when my name was put forward to be ambassador in Israel, a couple of American Jewish groups opposed my nomination. One of them was the Zionist Organization of America. And they took out ads suggesting that I was too anti-Israel to take this job. And they proposed instead an evangelical minister from Tennessee to become the ambassador. So that was my only real contact with them in that period. Okay. All right, well, the teaser for tomorrow, I'll just tell you what I'm going to cover in the morning, is we talked last night about the Arab-Israeli peace process, and this morning we extracted one issue and looked at the intersection of the land, its inherent holiness, and our behaviors. This afternoon was a little bit of anecdotes and what ambassadors do, and tomorrow we look at the broader environment, what's happening in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Iran, and the context in which, for example, Israel is asked to make choices when the security outside of its borders is up for question. So either that should interest you or the bagels, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.